Welcome to Lesson 7, Embracing a Risk Mindset in Product Development. In this lesson, we'll discuss the last step in the demand V, which is the verify or validate step. We'll talk about the importance of having a risk mindset in making sure that the design we make will be viable and feasible. Furthermore, we'll discuss FMEA as an approach to doing this design evaluation. In this lesson, we will now discuss the last step of the demand V, which is the verify or validate step. We'll talk about how we need to develop a risk mindset in product development in order to be able to mitigate, anticipate possible failures of our design before we actually commercialize it. We'll be using a technique called FMEA to be able to evaluate our design and even our processes. In the fifth step, verify and validate emphasizes on the importance of ensuring that the detailed designs we have come up would be able to meet the requirements that we wanted to satisfy at the very beginning. The verify and validate step focuses on ensuring that the design of the product meets the customer requirements that we have set at the very beginning. The product development team should ensure that the design should be compatible to its manufacturing processes and making sure that the product functions according to the intended use. Verify step can be done in two perspectives. First, making sure that you build the right product, and second, that you are building the product right. These two parts of the verification ensures both the product meeting the intended design and meeting the intended use or expectation of your customer. The verify or validate step can be done as follows. Conduct a verification and validation audit of the activities needed to ensure that the product is designed right. Evaluate the results and iterate the design based on the verification and validation activities. And finally, conduct a final design review based on the changes and the improvements done on the design as it pertains to the manufacturing processes themselves. One of the most important views needed in product development is the idea of having what we call a risk mindset. A risk mindset is the ability to be able to anticipate potential failures or what we call so-called risk that our designs might encounter not only with the users but in the whole life cycle of our product. When we talk about risk is simply defined as the impact of an event, a negative event, coupled with the probability that that event will happen. When we do a risk analysis, we are in fact doing the identification and prioritization of risk that would be associated to the design of our products or services or processes. When we act towards this risk in order to be able to manage the risk, we now identify actions needed to be able to minimize the risk. By developing a risk mindset, we are seeking to influence the risk, either by tackling the chances that it will happen or the effect of the risk. We have to take note that not all risk is bad. By having a risk-based thinking, this becomes our second nature to how we would actually look at our day-to-day life. A risk mindset means that we will tend to be more proactive. We acknowledge that risk is part of nature. We also put upon ourselves the responsibility to handle and deal with the risk. We also look towards risk as something that can be managed, and that risk is necessary as part of any choices we make. In the demand V, we now look at risk management as a way to evaluate and help improve our detailed design. One of the more powerful techniques or tools used in identifying and managing risk is what we call FMEA. FMEA refers to the failure modes and effects analysis technique. When you use FMEA, it is a structured, systematic approach to identifying, estimating, prioritizing, and evaluating the risk. Essentially, the FMEA has a built-in risk management view. The goal of FMEA is to prevent the failure of your design in your product. Very common applications of FMEA in DEx focuses on how we can mitigate the possible risk associated to the design and eventually in the production of your product in manufacturing. FMEA is best understood by starting with its worksheet. A typical FMEA worksheet would have the following major sections. You have the first section that covers in your left what we call the cause and effect analysis. This is where we talk about the potential cost of a particular item or object in your design and the effect of that object when the risk or the failure happens. The second part is trying to do what we call a prioritization of our failures by evaluating them. To be able to evaluate the failures, you can have three basic components of evaluating the potential failure or the risk of the failure. This is done by looking at the severity, the occurrence, and the detection. By using these three items, we will be estimating what we call the risk priority score or the risk priority number or the RPN. Once we have evaluated our risk, we need to be able to identify the appropriate countermeasures and how these countermeasures can eventually improve the risk score that we originally established. Let's take an example of a product called a lube system, where the goal is to be able to provide a way to change the oil of a particular equipment. So one of the ways by which we apply FMEA would be to start with the item of your design. So the item of your design could be one of your features or the component of your design. If this were talking about a personal care product, the item could be referring to the cap, the bottle, the formulation, or the ingredient. For each of this item, you get to evaluate now the potential failure of those items one by one. So for the lube system change example, which is a component of the overall lube system, the potential failure would be as follows related to the item that we started. Too much oil can come out of the system. Dirty oil can come out. There could be contamination. There could be a wrong type of oil coming out. These are potential failures related to that particular part or component of the lube system. For each of this potential failure, we will have a potential effect. The effect now is what the user will experience or will be able to see as a result of the failure. The potential effect oftentimes can be explained as something that will impact the user themselves. For each of this potential failure, they will produce a potential effect. What we will do is to evaluate each of the potential effect with what we call the severity. The severity is simply a scale, and it's usually 1 to 10, where you assign the score of how severe is the effect of that failure to the user. A score of 10 means it is actually detrimental to the person, to the safety of the person. It can even cause death. While a severity of 1 means that it doesn't have any impact to the customer. The potential cause is related to the failure itself. What can cause the failure? The potential cause refers to the potential failure on the second column of your template. We will now evaluate each of the potential cause by its occurrence. What's the likelihood that these causes will happen? The higher the score of the occurrence means the most often or more likely that cause is going to happen. In a design, we normally refer to the experience that the product development team would have in its prior experience in other designs and use it as a baseline to rate the occurrence of that particular cause. The third one is what we call the control. The control will be ways by which we can identify that such a failure will happen. How do we identify the failure can be detected? And by detecting the failure, we get to manage the risk. The detection is the score you give to the control. The higher the detection, the better the control in identifying the risk even before it happens. By multiplying the severity, occurrence, and detection, you now get what we call the risk score or the RPN. The higher the RPN, the more you put emphasis on mitigating or coming up with an action in order to bring down that particular failure mode and its effect. You now identify the corresponding actions and who will be in charge of ensuring that such actions are done in your design. When conducting an FMEA, using your design, begin by identifying the product components, the materials, the parts, and for each of this component or part, start with the part or component that has the most likely chance that failures can happen. This can be based from the product development team's experience or from the inputs coming from the other subject matter experts who are participating in your product development. When you now identify the product component, you begin to identify failure modes or likelihood of failures happening in relation to that particular component. When you identify the failure mode or the kind of failure that can happen, you now proceed by identifying the effect of that failure. Keep in mind that the effect of the failure is in relation to the person or a user or someone else, or even to the business, in which the failure can be disastrous or have a negative impact. In our step 4, we begin to identify what could have caused the failure to happen in the first place. So if an item would have a cap, and the cap can have a broken seal, then the effect of that broken seal would be a leak. What would have been the cause of the failure, which is the broken seal, can be attributed to a problem in the die, or the material being used being not the right one, or maybe in relation to the design itself, wherein maybe the cap could have some sort of a unlimited or maybe a limited thickness, and therefore it's not going to be enough, or even the thread can be one of those causes of the failure modes. Once you've identified the failure mode, its effect, and its causes, you now determine the likelihood or the chance that this failure mode is a high enough risk for you to consider. So this is where you now apply a scale, a rating scale. Once you've applied the necessary scale on all of this failure mode effects and causes, you can now compute for the RPN, or the risk priority number, and prioritize the RPN that has the highest value. Usually in practice, if the RPN would be 100 or above, it normally merits an attention by the product development team. Number 7, once you have prioritized the risk with the higher RPN, you now take an action, where the goal of the action is to mitigate or do something about your design, changing it to improve the risk. And then you go back and then you confirm the FMEA that you have started in the first place. A common scale used to rate the severity of your potential failure effect is to use this scale, where 10 is the worst effect, which could lead to an injury, and where 1 could be something where it would go unnoticed, or the performance would not be, any dip in the performance will not be noticed. If you go up the scale, then the impact of that particular failure is going to be higher and higher, or more costly. For the likelihood or the occurrence, you may also use this scale to estimate more or less how likely such a failure can happen. Take note that the occurrence or the probability of the failure is often based on what could have caused it or may cause it. So the value for occurrence is applied on the cause, while the severity is applied on the effect. Finally, for the detection, the goal here is to be able to notice the failure. So you go back to your failure mode and identify what could have been done, or is there something in the design that would allow you to see the failure. A detection is the ability of your design or something in your process that can tell you that something is wrong with your product. If the detection value is low, that means that there could be ways to inspect, and therefore the effect or the failure may be avoided or minimized. Or a 10, where when a defect happens, no one would even know, and therefore would merit a detection rating of 10. In general, when we now look at FMEA, FMEA can be applied in various situations in your product development process. You can apply FMEA by looking at the design from the concept stage and find ways to minimize or mitigate these failures early on in design. You can even do an FMEA of design, thinking about it when you're going to test it. In addition, by conducting an FMEA, they become a good input to what we call design reviews or toll gates, where only those designs that have passed the scrutiny of a risk assessment, maybe using FMEA, would give the go signal to proceed in your development cycle or phase. FMEA can also be applied on operations or processes and to look at what could be errors that can be encountered in your systems or processes. Furthermore, you can also apply FMEA when you talk about maintenance and looking at the reliability of the work done by maintenance and what could have gone wrong in spite of the maintenance. Some important learnings in this lesson. Risk is the impact of a failure coupled with the probability that will occur. When there is no failure or the likelihood is low, then risk will not be present. Second, FMEA is a structured way to be able to manage your risk. Helps you identify, estimate, prioritize, and evaluate the risk. Lastly, FMEA allows the product development team to pursue the needed actions early on in the design stage based on the risk assessment or the knowledge of the development team in terms of what could be the impact of these design components.